we've discussed already significant challenges facing Scotland, and yet, as we speak to each other right now, what is actually consuming the headlines in this country, and actually international headlines too? And it's a piece of legislation which you as Justice Minister a few years back championed. It's known as the Hate Crime and Public Order Act, something which seems to have got Scots at war with each other for no clear purpose. Do you regret being one of the architects of that piece of legislation?
I'm very proud of that legislation. Absolutely. That legislation. Well, let's just, again, provide some context. The stirring up offences against racial hatred have protected me as an individual since 1986. So most of my life. I was born in 1985.
Sure, but
so
this extends the act.
Well, exactly.
Changes it.
That's exactly the point. Now, because I'm protected as a person of colour against racial hatred being stirred up against me, why should somebody not be protected because of their disability, or because they're gay, or because they're transgender, or because they're Jewish? Well, they absolutely should be protected in the same way that I'm protected because of my colour. So for me, the extension of that protection, where the threshold is unbelievably high, so the criminal threshold to meet the new stirring up offences, your behaviour has to be threatening or abusive, and it has to be intended to stir up hatred. And of course, for all of that, there are a whole bunch of safeguards in place in terms of legislation.
It's complicated. The police in Scotland have now pledged, and they have a duty to investigate every hate crime complaint. You've just indicated there are all these different categories it can come under now. The police now have a massive job. The General Secretary of the Police Federation says it is a recipe for disaster. He says officers haven't been properly trained on how to deal with this. The police don't have time to deal with it, and he's pointed out that they're really struggling to deal with crime in Scotland as it is, and this is a massive new burden on top. It doesn't make sense.
Well, let's look at the stats and the figures. Crime is at one of its lowest levels in 40 years. That's the record of the SNP in the last 17 years that we've been in charge. So record levels, one of its record low levels of crime. Secondly, record investment in Police Scotland, thanks to the budget that we announced for 24-25. And let's look at the fact that, of course, when it comes to complaints that come in around hate crime, the police are exceptionally well trained in terms of how to deal with
and they've already had thousands. Well, it only came in on April 1st. They've already had thousands of complaints.
That's not what the Chief Constable said. The Chief Constable has made it really clear that officers have been trained. Officers will continue to receive training. But of course, dealing with hate crime is not something new for the police. They know how to deal with hate crime.
Your own party colleague, Joanna Cherry, Westminster MP, says that the hate crime laws are being weaponised to silence gender-critical women. It is a thought echoed by many feminists, they would describe themselves as, across Scotland. Are you too now worried about what this is going to do to freedom of speech on one very important social issue?
No, I don't. And I see no evidence of people being silenced in terms of their gender-critical views. Any cursory glance at any social media platform would suggest to you that those views are not being silenced.
Are you talking about J.K. Rowling, who, of course, the famous writer, she lives in Scotland. She, in the last few days, has made a point of using her social media platform to once again say to Scotland and to the world that transgender women are not women, they are men. She says freedom of speech and belief are at an end in Scotland if the accurate description of biological sex is deemed criminal. And she has invited the police to investigate her. Now, the police say they're not going to.
Well,
but now,
exactly the point.
Exactly. But you know what? The real point is there are now hundreds of transgender activists in your country who say that if this law is to mean anything,
you can't have it both ways.
J.K. Rowling must be investigated.
I'm afraid you can't have it both ways, Stephen. So what J.K. Rowling has managed to prove, if anything, is of course that simply putting out tweets that may well be ones that I absolutely disagree with, and they may be offensive, hurtful.
Do you disagree with them?
Yes, I do disagree with J.K. Rowling on a lot of her tweets.
And do you think she's peddling hate?
Can you just let me finish my point here? The point is that she then invited police to explore and examine her tweets, and the police made the obvious point, and it would be obvious to anybody who read the legislation that they weren't going to meet the criminal threshold of the stirring up offences that are in the Act. So she has just managed.
Obvious to many transgender activists in Scotland.
No, but
who say that if this act is to mean anything, then there has to be a proper investigation.
This act, and there was a proper investigation by police. The point of the act is to stop the stirring up offences, stirring up of hatred against a number of protected groups. We also, of course, have the common statutory aggravator framework, which has been consolidated and also been extended within the Act as well. But J.K. Rowling has managed to prove the point that for anybody who actually reads the legislation, there is a high threshold for criminality. So I wasn't at all shocked. I don't know anybody really who read the legislation that was shocked that Police Scotland would not...
Let me just ask you, if I may, a very simple question, because you're First Minister of Scotland, your voice matters. Is very publicly misgendering trans people, as those trans people would see it, misgendering trans people, is it threatening, abusive or insulting?
Look, I'm not going to be caught into this binary. It's deeply offensive.
Well, it's not binary. I'm trying to understand what this legislation which you've championed actually means.
For the stirring up of hatred, your behaviour has to be either threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. Misgendering somebody is unlikely to end up to meet those high criminal thresholds. Thresholds are deliberately very high. Misgendering somebody who's transgender, I think, is deeply offensive and upsetting. But the legislation isn't dealing with upsetting or offensive. It's dealing with behaviour that's threatening or abusive and intended to stir up hatred. Rightly, Parliament agreed to a very high criminal threshold because that is what is required.
Interestingly, you too have also been reported under the new hate crime legislation, and it actually, for many Scots who've reported you, goes back to a speech you made in 2020 where you went through a whole series of important senior public posts in Scotland which are held by white people, and you made a very powerful point about how white so many important positions in Scotland are, and you said it's not good enough. Now, Scotland is 96% white, and there are some very active people, particularly on social media, who are saying Humza Yousaf's message was essentially racist. It was anti-white, and I, for one, feel that this is stirring up hatred against me as a white person. The police aren't interested. They say it's nonsense. They're certainly not going to investigate it. Yeah. But under the new legislation, the police also have to, as I understand it, record it as a non-criminal hate incident, and you will be named. How do you feel about that?
So a couple of points to make. The description of those who reference that speech as hatred, I've not seen anybody who has described it in that way that isn't, frankly, part of the far right. The speech was in support of Black Lives Matters. I was making the point, of course, that people of colour need to be better represented in senior roles, and I'm proud to be the first person of colour who's now First Minister and the first Muslim leader of any Western nation. The second point I'd make around non-crime hate incidents being reported, one that's first of all recorded, that's a matter for Police Scotland. But remember, the reason for non-crime hate incidents being recorded is part of course, a recommendation from the Stephen Lawrence inquiry. It was part of the Macpherson report. So it's really for the police to decide how they record it.
You've seen another spike in hate directed towards you, and as you say, you're the first Muslim leader of a government in Western Europe. I just wonder whether you worry about the degree to which you and your family right now are being targeted by hate in this country.
I worry about hatred towards my family in particular. Obviously, I'm somewhat used to it, and that's not necessarily meaning that it's acceptable in any way, shape or form, but any cursory glance at social media would show to you death threats towards me on a regular basis, and I'm afraid that's somewhat part and parcel of being a person of colour and being in a high-profile position. Look, Scotland, like any other country in the world, has issues around institutional and structural racism. There's no doubt about that. Of course, we have racism in Scotland. We have racism in every single country. There's no doubt that Scotland is not immune to racism.
Let me ask you briefly, if I may, about Gaza. Members of your family, your wife's family, live in Gaza.